Welcome to this edition of the Post-Christian Podcast today. I'm excited to have with me Grant Faulk. How are you doing, Grant?
Doing great. Even better now that I'm with you.
Well, it's been a few weeks in the making,
Yeah.
introduced by a mutual friend. I guess you were officiating a wedding my friend here from Austin was at out in California, and she just thought, Eric, you got to meet Grant. He's doing some amazing things. Tell us a little bit about yourself for those who don't necessarily know some of the work you're doing.
So I am a person who's really passionate about seeing reconciliation happen on a variety of levels. So, of course, as somebody who's a minister of the gospel, reconciliation between God and man, reconciliation between people themselves, and then reconciliation with God's plan for our lives. You know what that's supposed to look like in practical ways. And so one of the things that has always been a passion of mine, due to my background as being both Jew and Gentile, and then also being married to a Black woman for 29 years and raising a multi-ethnic family, being involved in multi-ethnic ministry, and everything that goes along with that, both positive and negative, is really the last 2 years have really highlighted the fact that not enough has been done in that area. And so I'm really trying to figure out a way to address much of what you've had in previous podcasts with the post-Christian dynamic that we're dealing with here. And so that's really the main thing for me is being an instrument of healing and really um, helping things to move from where they've been to where God has for us to go.
You know, it's incredibly tragic, really, that the church isn't known as a place where reconciliation happens. When you read the scriptures, I mean, it's right there, Jew and Gentile becoming one family. And it sounds like that's your background personally, you know?
Yeah.
And I just wonder, why do you think the church is missing this moment? And what can we do to capture it? Because we're not going to reach the post-Christian world if we're not relevant to that world. And especially those who are Gen Z, millennials, they're not going to put up with the tribalism and the prejudice of their parents and grandparents.
Right. Yeah, I think that what's happened is, well, a few things. I think that there has been a truncated view of God and the gospel. I think that's the first issue that we've had. That because it's been so conflated and intertwined with Americanism. So not to say that America is a horrible place and we shouldn't love it, but I think that we've elevated it to the point where there's a muddying of the waters. And so human power being merged with the initiatives of God usually ends up with the initiatives of humans, not God. So being fulfilled. So I think that's really what we've seen happen. That's one of the things that I try to do is, there's a lot of people out there that are doing a great job at trying to give a better witness to the world of a more fuller concept of who God is, both righteousness and justice. In fact, it says that numerous times throughout the Bible. One of the favorite verses I know a lot of people like to quote is Psalm 89:14. The foundations of His throne are righteousness and justice. So I think first of all, we when we are only acknowledging a certain part of God's personhood and character, we're only going to end up with a limited amount of His heart, first of all, towards humanity. But we're also going to be limited in our effectiveness. We're not walking by the Spirit with the Spirit because we're denying parts of the Spirit's initiative to be concerned with the weightier matters of the law, mercy, and justice. And so I think that's this kind of the second issue. The third issue, I would say, is that even though we're in a post-Christian society and world, there's still enough Christian things being communicated, especially when we're being called on the carpet for not being consistent in our Christianity. to where they know that there's aspects of Christianity that do deal with issues of social justice and not only abortion or political things, but going into these other areas of racial justice, of economic justice, of different things like that. And so what happens is it's like that verse in I think it's Romans 8:19, where it talks about that all creation is waiting for the sons of God to be manifest. Like we know you have the answers. We know you have something that can help. You're not using it. Since you're not doing it, we're going to get up and we're going to do it. And so that's what we're seeing now. Is we're seeing the Gen Zers and millennials and whatever other label we want to put on the group is tired of waiting around for something that we could have and should have been doing more of. And so now they're taking up the banner and trying to do it the best they can.
Yeah, I mean, there was an interview a few back in my podcast with Derwin Gray, and I asked him about a quote I'd heard from him in another podcast about the young adults aren't leaving the church, they're leaving the white church, meaning the homogenous church. And I'll add to that, he didn't say this, but I think the reality is if you grew up in America, you grew up, especially as a Caucasian, probably with a hyper individualistic mindset. And so our Christianity became about you and God, and that was it. And certainly, your relationship with God should change how you treat your family, but it didn't really go beyond that. And if you learn from folks who grew up with different cultural context, that has more of a family orientation that is more communal, then all of a sudden you see a different expression of the same gospel message. But it's actually not just changing you and your relationship with God, but you should be changing the environment in which you live, bringing more of heaven to earth. One of the organizations you're a part of is called Civil Righteousness. I think the website is civilrighteousness.org. Talk about that.
Well, I got introduced to them in 2020 when everything was breaking loose, and we formed a kind of a local group here in Sacramento of just people who are concerned about getting Christians to realize that part of the gospel is doing justice, like you said, and which is kind of more of a communal aspect, communal focus. Instead of just me being individually righteous, this righteousness needs to manifest horizontally. And so one of the groups that we got connected to during that time through one of my ministry partners, Brittany Baker, was Civil Righteousness, and Jonathan Tremaine Thomas. And so he was really speaking into a lot of things prophetically at that time, and had been actually doing work in Ferguson. He started back with the Michael Bryant incident. He moved, picked up stakes, and God told him to go to Ferguson, Missouri, and be a peacemaker there. And so here he is, the 6'5", 6'6" African American man. So he has a kind of a commanding presence, but a very gentle touch. And so he's able to really, I think, do a lot to help move things along in the right direction in Ferguson, Missouri. And so then from there, it just grew to where it's national and even international to a certain extent, because he stepped out and chose to allow himself to be kind of put in that position. And so civil righteousness, basically the mission statement is reconciliation and restorative justice through culture, through spiritual, cultural, and economic renewal. And so it's making this thing not only something that we talk about, but that we be about. And so there's different things that happen with civil righteousness. There's things that are done, whether it be prayer. There's a lot of networking with other organizations like 24/7 Prayer. Lisa Coons, which, by the way, she'd be a great interview too. She's in Tulsa, I think. And then One Race out of Atlanta. And Campaign, also out of Atlanta. Be the Bridge, Latasha Morrison. So in fact, also right, I think locally you've got somebody there with Michelle Ami Reyes there with the Asian American Christian Coalition. It's just this network just kind of formed. And so even though my main commitment is to civil righteousness, we end up finding each other. People who are in this work, we end up finding each other. I joke that in 2020, after everything happened, and at first a lot of Christians, kind of had the aha moment. A lot of white evangelical Christians, of course, Black Christians have been living through this forever, but a lot of more people who are more sheltered from that had their epiphany briefly, until the pundits started weighing in and basically giving people reasons to not be compassionate. So at that time, I was really just lamenting that, man, I feel like I'm all alone. A lot of the people that I had been doing life and ministry with now were, ostracizing me, and didn't really want to hear this stuff. And so I, had that Elijah moment, in the wilderness. Oh, I'm the only one. Everybody's turned again. And so after we formed this group, I realized I wasn't alone, and there's more than 7,000 other people out there like me, and so I think that's been encouraging. However, since then, as most things that kind of have a fervor at first, eventually that fervor kind of starts to peter out, and especially as people experience trauma and isolation and other things that come as a result of doing this kind of work. And so yeah, I'm thankful for civil righteousness. Thankful for all these different ministries that are doing this work, because it does help to keep us going, and also gives hope that more people can be reached.
Well, and that's the beauty. Tasha Morrison actually was a part of our team here at Gateway, and was just, I mean, every day off ended up being a speaking engagement. So eventually she moved to full time, Be the Bridge, and that's worked out great for her.
Mhm.
And I remember when I was in Los Angeles at Mosaic, Erwin McManus, our pastor there, would say, whenever the church did not rise up to its calling, a parachurch ministry would start. When the church wasn't giving youth a mission, that's when YWAM was born. When the church wasn't reaching campus, the campuses, Campus Crusade was born. And you can just go on in history. And I think this is another one of those moments where the church has shied away from being reconcilers and peacemakers in a very polarized world. We get sucked into one side or the other in politics instead of rising above that.
Mhm.
It's like, civil righteousness, Be the Bridge, these other organizations that you've mentioned are trying to stand in the gap. And my hope is, and maybe you've seen this, it's amazing how when you're doing this work, there are people who are not believers who believe in racial reconciliation that might get caught up in the story of God's redemption, them personally. And then there's also, I think, skeptical believers who might be on the edge of deconstruction that might see what you and these other organizations are doing and say, okay, wait, no, that's what's been missing. Talk about when you say reaching people, have you seen folks coming to faith or discovering kind of a fuller, more vibrant faith?
Yes, I'd like to say that it's happened more than I've seen it, but I have seen it. There is. It's interesting. Yeah, we're in some cases we're almost able to reach the unchurched and the unbelieving. In some cases easier than we are. People who you think would get it because it's right there in Scripture. Like, just read the whole thing instead of just the bits and pieces you want to read. And so that's been interesting. There's actually. We had, unfortunately, a hashtag here in Sacramento back in 2018 with Stephon Clark being one of those police-related fatalities, and so through our work, we've actually become connected to them, to that family, through Stevante Clark, his brother, who is part of National Action Network now as a result of that. And so, he, not to say that they're not all believers, some of them are believers, but it's a mixture. And the thing is I think that it's almost like there's a sense of relief, like I was saying with my third point. It's like they know we've got something. They've seen things in the past, like with Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. so that they've heard things from the Bible in quotes, when it comes to certain occasions. So they know that there's something there, and that Christians at times have done some good things when it comes to a gospel that's more holistic and comprehensive. And so when they finally see it in real life right in front of them, and they hear somebody like myself, who obviously it looks different than them, they're kind of like, oh yes, like I don't know if they say thank God, but yeah, they're thankful to whatever. So that has happened, and then also just providing spaces, yeah, for Christians. So the church I was previously at, I led co-facilitated a group called Real Life Unity, and so that was Real Life Unity Talks is what it was called. And so that was a place for people like myself, most of them not being connected to ministries that I was connected to. So for us to be able to have these conversations that first of all dealt with the issues that need to be dealt with, but then also put them in contact with other organizations outside of us where they can get content, they can get training, they can get the things that people need to be able to feel a sense of hope. And I think that's one of the main things, at least for me, is it's one thing to just hear the right stuff and say the right stuff, but when you actually feel like you're being part of the solution, to me that's like the biggest source of hope. When I'm not doing anything, like there's like right now we're kind of on hiatus, it's like I get so much in my head that I start to think that maybe it's too much, it's too hard, it's but when you're actually out there doing the work and you're seeing differences being made, it's just like anything else, like ministry or anything else, you feel like there's a sense of hope and purpose, and that's what keeps you going.
That's right. Yeah, and to me, it's one of those things that I think there are some white evangelicals that shy away from this topic because of the news station they might be watching, or some of these straw men thrown out, like critical race theory and all these conspiracy theories. But I do think that it's much simpler than that. It's literally about learning to be an empathetic listener, to be a peacemaker, to be someone willing to have conversations, to hear someone else's story, to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I mean, so much of the work that I've seen, the organizations you've mentioned, another one we've worked with is Stronger Together. I don't know if you know Dr. Clarence Hill.
Yes.
His work through the Dream Clock has been really beautiful. I mean, he is very intentional about not using partisan language, about sticking with what the scriptures say and calling people to love their neighbor. And their neighbor might look differently than them.
Hmm.
Their neighbor might have experienced trauma and things that you haven't, which doesn't make you guilty. It makes you an advocate if you're willing.
Yes.
What are some other next steps or a first step for a pastor who's trying to figure out, how do I step into this world without getting lumped into the partisanship? What's some advice you would give?
I would say like what you've done, you Stronger Together. I heard you also were doing a series called Voices. I think was that through Our Daily Bread, what they do.
Well, actually, we featured them on Juneteenth. They
Okay.
wrote a great Juneteenth devotional. So, Voices is oftentimes linked to authors that we bring in, and sometimes it's people from different ethnic backgrounds whose story is different than ours. Other times, it's more about like a scientist who came to faith or that sort of thing. But
Mhm.
but yeah, I like where you're headed. Just this kind of idea of creating space for new voices.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that to get equipped to allow ourselves to be rediscipled, as David Swanson talks about rediscipling the white church. I think that we have to understand that we've been given a limited gospel. Now, I know that people are going to scream, "What do you mean? It's sufficient." Of course, it's sufficient. Salvation is the first step, but we are saved unto good works, and so those works are laid out in things like doing justice. Jesus in his first sermon, Luke 4, talks about being anointed by the Spirit to preach good news to the poor, to set the prisoners free, to open blind eyes, and then also finally to set the oppressed free. And then also, this whole concept of jubilee. He ends that statement with of waiving debts, of setting slaves and people free, and wiping the slate clean, and starting over. And so I think that the thing is to really tap into groups who are already doing this stuff. So whether it be civil righteousness, one race, people like that, and allow yourself to be rediscipled. One race actually does stuff where they do work with pastors to help pastors better understand why we're in the mess that we're in, and what we need to do moving forward. And I think the other thing too is just proximity. You mentioned compassion. You can't be around suffering people and not have compassion, especially if you really have the Holy Spirit within you. So I think that it's key. I mean, I think for me, I've been in the minority in most environments I've been in for the last 30 years, 32 years, 33 years. So when I'm now in that position of being in the minority and not having the power, not having the final say, and having to humble myself and learn how to work with people in a more communal way, and not be so individualistic, and not be so rights focused on my own rights, but rather advocating for the rights of others, as we're called to do in Isaiah and other places. But I think that's the key, is these pastors have to get out of the comfortable spaces that they've been in, where everybody is coming from a certain sociological and political and economic and ethnic background, and not just pick and choose people who look different than us but agree with us. Actually be in spaces where we're being challenged, where iron is sharpening iron, and we're having to decenter ourselves and decenter our culture. And because a lot of people don't realize it. I mean, like Daniel Hill talks about in Wide Awake, is that a lot of white people, we think we don't have any cultural influence. Like, we don't have a culture. We go to an event, like he talked about his best friend that was Indian American, and was South Asian Indian, and was having a wedding, and everything that was associated with the wedding, the cultural. And Daniel Hill said to him, wow, this is really cool. I wish we had culture, as white people. And the Indian friend said to him, you do have a culture, and your culture has, is the dominant influence. So the sooner and understand what your culture is and what it's doing, the better off we're all going to be. So I think that once we decenter ourselves and stop normalizing our experience, then that's when we can start to have compassion for others, and realize that what we're hearing on the media is slanted. Yeah. On both sides.
Both sides. That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, we read that book after the tragedy with George Floyd, Wide Awake, and I thought that was a great story you just shared, because in essence, for those of us who are white, we're it's like a fish describing water. It's like it's just what you live in. But if you're not white, you absolutely see the barriers and the boundaries that a white predominant culture creates. I used to say, or I guess I still joke from time to time, if it was just about us and God, then when we came to faith, the pastor should have just kept us under during the baptism so we could go straight to Jesus. But he doesn't. He brings us out of the water because there are good things for us to do, and bringing more of heaven to earth. Another resource to mention, justpaxcollective.com. That's a campus pastor, two of our pastors here at our church that help pastors kind of with those next steps. Well, Grant, I'm just really grateful for the work you've been doing. Thankful for the time with you today. Thanks for these insights, and God bless. Keep up your great work.
Thank you. God bless, and appreciate everything you're doing.